So when you see injustice in the world, do you ever wonder why it feels so wrong? Like if the universe is just random atoms, where does that feeling come from? Stick around and find out.
Coming from the wild, from the rain and the stone, where the wind has no name and the traveler's alone. There's warmth in the fire and truth in the tale of the watcher who walks where the bold-hearted fail.
He carries no sword, yet the darkness gives way to the lantern he lifts at the end of the day. He stands on the watchtower, still and unswayed, where the lost find a path through the fog and the fray. Pilgrim gray, oh steward of the lands, you carry the light in your weather-worn hands. A tale at the hearth, a guide through the night. You open the gate between the wrong and the right.
Well, all right, folks, pull up a chair. It's the Pilgrim's Gray Inn, and this is where ancient mysteries meet modern questions. So, welcome. Robert Clark, your host. I'm your host, and I'm grateful you've joined us on this particular deep dive. We're kind of doing apologetics for the moment. Today's episode is entitled From Logic to Love, How the Reality of Evil Points to the Moral God. And we're going to journey from one of the most abstract arguments for God's existence. Well, we're going to briefly overview it since we went over it last week, to one of the most visceral challenges against it, and finally to a profound conclusion that ties it all together, so that by the end we'll see how even the reality of evil in our world can be a clue, ironically enough, to the existence of a moral God who is love. Tonight, we'll start with logic, a brief look at the ontological argument for God's existence, a purely logical case that God must exist. I'll do it briefly because, again, we spent over an hour on it last week. Then we'll confront the age-old problem of evil. How can a good God or an all-powerful God allow evil and suffering? And we'll touch on both the strict logical form of that problem and the more intuitive evidential form. And here's where things get interesting, because from the depths of that problem, we plan to pivot with some insight from C.S. Lewis, insight that surprisingly turns the problem of evil on its head. And then finally in section 4, we're going to develop a robust but accessible, I think, I guess sort of you could consider it a modus tollens for the moral argument. Um, I'm going to be using the argument that was utilized by Dr. William Lane Craig because I think he poses it correctly in a way that makes it more airtight. And we will be answering some objections like we did with the ontological argument, like morality is just evolution, or the famous Euthyphro dilemma, that many atheists will use in an argument about God and morality. And through it all, we're going to keep our tone passionate, thoughtful, and spiritually grounded. And whether you're a devout believer or you're a skeptic or a seeker, I invite you to think deeply with me here on this, and let's reason together and maybe even glimpse a bigger spiritual war behind the scenes. So get comfortable, maybe imagine the crackle of a hearth here at the Pilgrim's Gray Inn, and let's journey from logic to love, shall we? So our first logical starting point is the ontological argument, right? It's one of the most abstract arguments for God's existence. And I know I'm wearing glasses today. My eyes have been bothering me and giving me a headache all days, and it just made it easier for me to be able to read my notes here and not strain and be squinting so, and forgive my drinking of water. if I don't have it with me like I did last week, I begin to lose my voice. So, anyway, if you've never heard of it and you didn't watch last week's show, it's kind of a heady idea. I'm not going to go into the detail I did in that other video here because we've already covered it, but it was a argument that was first proposed and popularized by Saint Anselm in the 11th century and has been refined since then by philosophers over the years, including Alvin Plantinga, whose work I primarily relied upon for the formulation of my video last week. But in simple terms, it argues something like this. You go from a definition like God is the greatest possible being we can conceive of, right? What philosophers would call a maximally greatest being, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, and so on. And then the premises that support the argument would be it is possible that such a maximally great being exists, at least in theory, and some possible reality, right? It's logically coherent. And then we use logic. If it is even possible for a maximally great being to exist, then by the very nature of maximal greatness, that being would exist in every possible reality, because a truly all-powerful necessary being wouldn't just exist in some imaginary world and not in others, including the real world. And so every possible reality would include the actual world. And then we conclude by saying, therefore, if God possibly exists in the maximally great sense, then God must exist in reality. So I know that sounds like we are using logic to place God into existence, but in a sense we are. There's nothing wrong with using logic and thinking, right? So to rephrase more concretely, if God exists in any conceivable scenario, his existence would be necessary. So he'd exist in all scenarios, including the real world. And so God's existence would move from possibility to actuality by the force of logical necessity. And as one summary puts it, God possibly exists, therefore he must exist. That's about as simple and short of a phrasing of that argument as you can make. So now the ontological argument is elegant and mind-bending. It's like a mathematical proof about God, and not everyone finds it convincing at first glance. I've been debating a couple of people on the Facebook page about it. After all, it's not based on physical evidence, but on the very concept of God. Some people say it's like defining God into existence, which sounds, iffy, right? It's suspect. But in fact, even many theists scratch their heads at this argument. Philosophers have spent centuries discussing it, raising objections, like I mentioned last week. Like, what about a maximally great pizza? Does that logic make make pizza God? To which the answer is that a maximally great pizza is a silly, incoherent idea, whereas a maximally great being isn't. And I went into great detail in our last video explaining why. So I'm not going to go into all the nuances here. But the reason I bring up the ontological argument at all is just to set the stage to show how, through pure logic, one can argue for the existence of God without needing any physical evidence necessarily. It's a reminder that belief in God isn't only based on blind faith. How ironic that I say that and I'm sitting here wearing glasses. No, I mean, not that I'm blind, but anyway. There are rigorous intellectual arguments behind it, and the ontological argument appeals to the mind, to reason. It whispers that if we think clearly enough about what God is, we discover that God has to exist. And it's probably why Scripture says the fool in his heart has said that there is no God. But the reason I bring up, again, is just stage setting. And for now, we're going to step from the airy realm of logic down to the ground level of reality, because even if the mind finds a logical case for God, the heart raises a powerful objection, right? Perhaps the most emotionally potent objection to God's existence, and the one I've encountered the most often. What about evil? What about all the pain, the suffering, the injustice in the world, and how does that square with the God of maximal greatness, who is supposed to be all good and all powerful and loving and so on and so forth, right? So this is where many people move from logic to a very personal doubt, especially when encountering personal tragedy, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this. I want you to know why you believe what you believe so that you're grounded, so that when earth-shaking or painful sufferings in your life don't cause you to falter in doubt, that you have a solid foundation that you're building your house of faith on. So you might grant that a maximally great being makes sense in theory or logically, but then you look at the world and see natural disasters, diseases, atrocities, and personal heartbreak, children born with brain cancers, this horrible trafficking of children going on, and something doesn't add up, right? If God exists, why does evil exist? If an all-loving Father is a ruling reality, why does the world suck so bad or often feel so cruel? And these questions are not just academic, right? These are just human questions. You don't have to be a philosopher to ask. We all experience it. So let's talk about the problem of evil in general, because I might cover that next week instead of something else I wanted to cover. But I just wanted to cover it in general for a moment, for what we're about to transition into. So, and as we talk about it, keep that ontological argument in your back pocket, because we're going to circle back from evil to a new kind of logic, one that might surprise you. So the problem of evil has been called the rock of atheism, the hardest question for theists to answer, and it comes in a couple of forms. So let's talk about the two main formulations that philosophers discuss. Basically, we're just going to go into some technicalities of the emotional issue here. You know, think of it as, instead of just eating the pie, we're going to find out what the ingredients are in it, right? Most of us just experience evil and it sucks, and that's like eating the pie. You get to taste it and experience it and so on. But let's find out why this pie tastes so terrible. So first we have the logic problem of evil, and it is a bold, absolute claim that says it is logically impossible for the God of classical theism, or the Christian God, or an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good and evil to both exist at the same time. In other words, if evil exists, God cannot exist. End of story. So the idea is that there's a contradiction buried in the concept of a perfectly good, all-powerful God allowing any evil. So an all-good God would want to eliminate evil entirely. An all-powerful God could eliminate evil entirely. And yet, here we are with our crappy tasting pie, right? Evil still exists. And so some argue it's logically inconsistent to believe God exists while also acknowledging the reality of evil and suffering. So it's a deductive argument, and it tries to show a flat-out contradiction, as if when we're saying it is raining and not raining at the same time. See, does that make sense? I'm trying to make it to where this is not just boring philosophical talk. I want you to follow and understand what we're doing. So then we have the evidential or probabilistic is a hard word to say, problem of evil. It's a softer claim, but honestly, this is the one that people make more often in real life. This is what you encounter when people are hurt and suffering, because most people don't think of the logical problem of evil. They primarily think this pie tastes terrible. They don't care what the ingredients are. They just want to spit it out of their mouth and have nothing to do with it. So this is a softer claim, but in many ways, it's way more compelling to the average person. It says, okay, maybe it's not logically impossible for God and evil to coexist, but given the sheer amount and kinds of evil we see, it sure isn't very, isn't it very unlikely that God exists based on that. And therefore it becomes very difficult for people to even want to think about the existence of God in such a terrible world. I know plenty of people like this. I work with them. So this argument doesn't claim an outright contradiction. Instead, like the first one I just gave you, instead it appeals to the apparent pointlessness or horrendous scale of suffering as evidence against an all-loving, all-powerful deity. And this is why you will encounter it more often. This one says, why would a loving God allow this much pain or evils of this horrific nature? Maybe a little evil for free will's sake, but do we really need things like child torture or genocide or natural disaster that kills thousands? Or like people who torture their animals. Animals just want to love us. Why would somebody torture a dog? What is wrong with these people? And what is wrong with God for him to allow it? So the evidential problem is more about weighing probabilities and intuitions. It feels like God wouldn't let the world be the way it is. So probably he isn't really there, or isn't the God we thought he is. And if he is, then I don't want to be around him or do anything with him. And that's just basically born out of a misunderstanding of not only evil, but the world and who God is in general. So let's correct that. But first, a drink of water. I try to do that away from the mic because I hate that sound. All right. I don't like listening to when somebody else is drinking water either, gulping in their throat or whatever. So let's address these in turn, starting with the logical problem. The logical version, as a strict argument, has pretty much been destroyed or defeated in philosophical circles. And that might surprise you, really. Like defeated. Oh, yeah, really? Well, yes. Over the last few decades, even atheist philosophers have conceded that the existence of God is not logically incompatible with the existence of evil. Now, you might say, why? What's your proof? Well, it's largely due to the work of, again, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, among others, and also his famous free will defense, which we might get into next week with Molinism and God's mental knowledge and things of that nature. Because there's all kinds of questions that go along with that, right? Why did God create people he knew would go to hell? So we can handle that next week. But in the meantime, Plantinga argued, in essence, that as long as it's even possible that God had a good reason to allow evil, then there's no logical contradiction between God and evil. He suggested one very plausible possible reason, which is free will. And he makes a very good case in that defense, and maybe I'll link it in my description. So imagine a world with creatures like us who have genuine free will. And look, I get it. Atheists and Christians alike disagree on this. There are Christians who do not believe we have free will. Most of them are reformists, and I get that. I kind of used to be that way myself. But I no longer, because it never really sat well with me. And after further investigation, I realized that tulip is not what it's cracked up to be. We'll just put it that way. And the main problem I have is with the I, irresistible grace. If it's irresistible grace, then and to me, it can't really be love because there's no free will involved. You're just a meat puppet. So anyway, we can make real choices between good and evil. That free will is a great good. It allows for genuine, real love, all right? And goodness chosen freely, moral growth, and meaningful relationships, and so on. But if creatures are truly free, then by definition, God cannot and will not, as we've seen, force them to always do what is good. Otherwise, it's not really free will at all. Like the people that love you, if you were just controlling them to love you, it's not really love. It's just you controlling them. So, which some people who are narcissists try to do and fail, and we have broken relationships. So some of these free creatures might choose evil, right? God could eliminate evil only by eliminating free will or the creatures themselves, which would, and I'm only saying this in our current state of affairs, because I believe that free will can exist without the choice of evil, but it must first come in this flavor so that we have those who will choose God and those who will not. And it kind of seals the deal. So that when a new heaven and new earth is created, we can choose within a range of things that are good. Anyway, sorry for that sidetrack. And so it would also, like I said, eliminate the greater good that free will provides. Plantinga's defense doesn't assert that this is definitely God's reason. It just shows that it's possible for God to have a reason which is enough to defeat the first claim of a strict contradiction. So, in a nutshell, the logical problem said God and evil cannot coexist, period. And Plantinga responded, yes, they can. Here's a possible story of how. Free creatures, blah, 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 right? And that story is internally consistent, so the alleged contradiction disappears. So the first argument from evil is really defeated. Even the prominent atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie, who himself had argued for the logical incompatibility of God and evil, eventually admitted that Plantinga's free will defense had essentially solved the logical problem of evil. Mackie conceded that the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God is not rendered impossible by the existence of evil. And so today, philosophers widely agree that there's no logical impossibility in God and evil coexisting. God could have had reasons that we don't fully know or understand. Plantinga gave one, free will, and what the ultimate result of that will be, and perhaps maintaining the conditions for moral freedom or perhaps other reasons beyond our understanding, right? The best way to phrase it is just to say morally sufficient reasons, like William Lane Craig states. Anyway, they justify God in allowing some evil for a limited period of time. So, and let's just be clear, saying the logical problem of evil is solved doesn't make the emotional problem vanish, right? Because I'm sure some of you are thinking, okay, the pie still tastes like dung. So logic or not, you haven't gotten rid of the taste. So it's one thing to show in a philosophy seminar that there's no formal contradiction here. And it's quite another thing to entirely to stand in a cancer ward at the site of a tragedy and feel that resolution in your heart, right? Or watching your dog die from being eaten alive by worms. So the evidential problem of evil remains deeply challenging. I think it's the best argument atheists have against God. So that being said, let's talk about that evidence or experiential side. So this is where most people actually struggle, the vast majority. And we can look at the world and say, I just can't imagine any good reason that could possibly or would justify this much suffering. It's not that we're claiming absolute logical certainty that God can't exist. It's more that it appears so unlikely that a loving God is at the helm, given the horror show we see or how bad this pie tastes in our pie analogy. So how might those of you who are listening as believers respond? Well, entire books can and have been written on this, but I'll summarize a few thoughts because solving the problem of evil is not my goal here necessarily, but I did want to talk about it because of what we're about to talk about next. But one approach is often called skeptical theism. Not skeptical about theism, but skepticism about our ability to judge God's reasons. So it suggests that just because we can't see a good reason for some evils, that does not mean that no such reason exists. Think of it like this. If God is as far above us as we think in wisdom and knowledge, right? He is maximally great, knows everything, all powerful, then we shouldn't expect to always grasp his plans, right? The fact that some suffering seems pointless to us might be due to our limited perspective. We don't know hardly anything. So, and I'm not just trying to cop out here, but it truly is a humble admission of our cognitive limits, right? We don't know everything. When I was a child getting a vaccine, I didn't see any good in it. I only felt the needle's pain and my parents holding me down, right? So from my toddler perspective, it was like a betrayal and utterly gratuitous suffering. It's only later that I could understand a reason, the idea of preventing disease that justified the pain, even though I question even that now, but that, I'm just using that as an example. So in a similar way, we as spiritual children might not fully fathom God's reasoning in the big picture of history and eternity. Or here's another angle. Many theists point to the way suffering can lead to growth, right? Virtue or other goods. And this is often called a soul-making theodicy. Blah. Um, After Irenaeus or modern proponents like John Hick, they're the ones that popularized this idea. So it notes that virtues like courage, compassion, forgiveness, and perseverance only exist in a world where pain, danger, wrongdoing, and hardship exist. So there's a side to good and love we could never know without the suffering. And that's why I think in this current state of affairs, like I mentioned previously or alluded to previously, that we have to experience this before we get to a world where we can only choose within a realm of things that are good with our free will. So anyway, this would be a world with no, a world, well, anyway, a world with no danger would never know courage, right? A world with no one in need or suffering might never know sacrificial love or empathy, right? And as Hick argued, perhaps a world that is a challenging place to live, right? A veil of soul making, as he put it, is one in which free beings can develop into more morally and spiritually mature creatures as a result. And this is not to glorify suffering, because suffering sucks. Nobody wants to eat a crappy tasting pie. It's still intrinsically bad, right? But to suggest it's not incompatible with an ultimately good purpose is the point, right? We should also mention the Christian perspective that God himself entered into the world of suffering in the person of Jesus, right? God isn't a distant, cold deity watching us suffer, right? In Christian understanding, God knows suffering intimately. The cross, the crucifixion of Christ, is the paradoxical centerpiece of our faith. The worst evil ever committed, the torture and murder of the innocent Son of God, becomes the means of the greatest good, redemption and hope for humanity. And it's a legal process as well. There's multiple layers to this. It's as if God were saying, I will take the very worst the world can do, and through it, I will open the door to the very best, right? Resurrection, defeat of sin, and death. And it paves the way for you. It legally paid for everybody's sin, including yours, you listening right now. And so this doesn't answer every why, right? Far from it, but it demonstrates that God can and does bring meaning and hope out of the darkest evil. We have examples all throughout Scripture, right? Joseph, you meant it, you my brothers, who threw me in this pit, hoping I'd die, and then sold me off and whatever. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for my good and for our good, because he wound up saving all of them from starvation with his dreams that he was given about Pharaoh, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of starvation. If you know the story, you know what I'm talking about. So the promise is that ultimately God will wipe away every tear and right every wrong, not by ignoring evil, but by overcoming it. And that's what he did. So now I realize some of those responses might feel abstract because you're not experiencing it right now, or insufficient when you're hurting. The problem of evil isn't something we solve like a math equation, and it hasn't been completely solved yet either. It's a future thing. And so let's not be feeling sorry for when God does decide to unleash his wrath on a unloving world that has created evil, and we experience what we deserve here either. So anyway, it's something we struggle through. The Bible itself is full of people crying out, why, Lord? Like, just read the entire book of Job, or a whole bunch of the Psalms have that about it, right? There's kind of a mystery here, and we are allowed to lament and to not fully understand. God understands that, just like you do with your own kids when they don't fully get it. Why can't I stay up till midnight and watch Cartoon Network? Well, because you have school in the morning. So what? Who cares? Well, I care. I'm your parent. So anyway, now what I want to do here is to guide our thinking into a new direction, one that maybe you haven't considered before. And it's kind of a judo move, using the momentum of the problem of evil and flipping it, for those of you who like cage fighting. Um, what if the very fact that we recognize something as evil is telling us something important about reality? What if our outrage at injustice, our sorrow over suffering, our sense that things are not the way they're supposed to be is actually a clue in favor of God rather than against Him? Now, that sounds counterintuitive, I realize, but some of the greatest thinkers who wrestled with doubt ended up seeing this very point, one of my favorites. And none expressed it better, in my opinion, than a man who was once an atheist himself, C.S. Lewis. Um, so let me share with you a famous insight from C.S. Lewis, the author of Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia, if you know him by that, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all of that. I liked Tolkien's work better, but I also like Lewis. I really prefer Lewis's Christian writings to his fiction. Although Out of the Silent Planet science fiction trilogy was pretty good too. So Lewis was an atheist in his early adulthood, largely because of the problem of evil, right? He looked around the world, especially the brutality and senseless suffering he witnessed during World War One, and concluded that the universe was cruel and therefore, in his mind, godless. But later, upon reflection, he had a revelation that turned his thinking upside down, and he wrote this. And this was influential in my own thinking about the world, even though I already believed in God when I read it. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" So this is a profound observation. Lewis realized that in order to call something unjust or evil, he must be measuring it against some concept of justice or good. But if the whole universe were truly meaningless and without God, where would he ever get such a concept? Right? You don't know what a crooked line is unless you have an idea of a straight line. So if the whole show were truly bad and senseless from top to bottom, how would we even recognize it as bad and senseless? Or some people say, if we just evolve from unliving matter and material into what we are now, how can we even trust that anything that we're thinking is our own thought or whatever? It's just the chemicals telling us what to think or say. We can't trust any of it. Whatever it is, it would just be, right? And yet Lewis found himself vehemently hating certain things as evil, which implied he believed good and evil were real qualities, not just personal preference or what your molecules or chemicals are telling you. So he goes on to say, in effect, I could have said that my idea of justice was nothing more than a private illusion of mine, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapses because my argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not just that it didn't suit my fancies. So therefore, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, that the whole universe was senseless, I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. So in other words, evil as a reality pointed to a standard of good as a reality. If I complain, this is wrong, unjust, evil, then I'm implying there is a true right, a real just, a real good by which to measure it. And that was a turning point for Lewis. So the staunch atheist essentially said, whoops, by acknowledging evil is real, I've implicitly conceded good is real, and a real moral law implies a moral lawgiver or higher standard beyond mere nature. And as he famously summarized elsewhere, quote, "If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning." Just as if there were no light in the universe, we wouldn't know it was dark because we'd have never seen light. Our very ability to be outraged by evil and to recognize injustice suggests that we have some innate knowledge, like Scripture says, the law is written on our hearts, and however dim it is, of justice and goodness. And this is a pivot point. We are turning from the problem of evil now to what's called the moral argument for God's existence. The moral argument essentially says objective moral values and duties exist, and the best or only explanation for their existence is God. Therefore, God exists. That's not the way I'm going to phrase the argument later when I tell you what the modus ponens are for it, but I'll get to that. So I can imagine some of you thinking, whoa, hold on. Are you saying atheists can't be moral or know right from wrong without God? Well, obviously not. Atheists can know moral values. I believe everyone has some sense of the moral law written on their hearts, like I said a little bit ago. And atheists certainly can live moral lives, caring for others, fighting injustice, sometimes putting religious folks to shame, quite frankly. The question is not whether you need to believe in God to recognize moral truth or to act morally. The question is more philosophical. If there is no God, what is the foundation for the moral truths or objective morality we recognize? Are moral values real or just illusions? Is morality objectively binding? Like, none of us should think that raping a small child and torturing the child just for pure enjoyment is a good thing, or just a product of evolution in society. In a universe without God, can the concepts of good and evil be anything more than personal or cultural preferences? So the moral argument I'm about to unfold says that without a transcendent anchor, or you could say a true north compass point, God, objective morality loses its foundation. Yet we all sort of live as if some morals are objective. For example, that love is good and torturing children is evil, truly evil, not just by convention. And even though there are some people who sickly enjoy it, we all recognize that they're sick, and even they do to a degree because they hide it. So we have a sort of clue that God exists because he is the best explanation for the moral reality that we know and we experience. So let's proceed carefully here because this argument needs to be rock solid, premise by premise. And so I'm going to go over William Lane Craig's version of this, clear, logical, also addressing common objections. And by the end, we'll see if the conclusion holds, that the reality of evil and good indeed points to the reality of a moral God, which I believe it does. So here we are. So we've arrived at the moral argument for God's existence. Now, I find this argument both intellectually compelling and personally moving because it touches our everyday experience of right and wrong, love and conscience, right? So let's lay it out in a straightforward way, and then we'll unpack it piece by piece, answering objections along the way. It's a pretty short argument. And here's the common formulation of the moral argument used by Dr. Craig and others, and it goes like this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. And then the conclusion, number 3, therefore, God exists. So this is what is called a logically valid syllogism. If 1 and 2, the premises are true, 3 has to follow logically. It's inescapable. So the key is, are the premises true? Premise 2 states that objective moral values and duties exist. Premise 1 states that without God, such objective moral values or morality would not exist. So we'll look at both. But first, note the wording, moral values and duties. So by moral values, we mean things that are good or bad, like justice, love, mercy are good. Selfishness, cruelty, and so on are bad. By moral duties, we mean obligations or rules about what we ought to do or not to do, like you shall not murder, right? Expresses a duty not to kill innocent people, primarily children. Also, a key is the word objective. Objective moral values and duties means they are valid and binding independently of human opinion. Just like we said before, just because some guy gets his jollies torturing and raping children does not mean it's okay, right? We recognize that person as horrible and evil for inflicting suffering on an innocent, regardless of his opinion. So in other words, even if the whole world decided that, say, the Holocaust was good, right? It would still not be okay. Even if a society thinks genocide is permissible, it is not permissible. These morals are not mere preferences or cultural fashions. They're more like facts of the matter, like 2 + 2 = 4. And by contrast, subjective morality would be like your personal taste, right? It's only true relative to the subject. Like chocolate is the best flavor in the world, right? It's subjective, not objectively true for everyone, right? Otherwise, I don't know how we could even have laws in the book. If we're going to decide that objective moral values and duties don't exist. That's not how we live life. We have entire moral codes and courts and laws based off the fact that objective moral values and duties exist. So, drink of water. Hold on. Most of us live as if some morals are objective, right? We say things like, what the terrorists did was evil, period. Not just, I personally don't like it. It's just not my thing. Or Nelson Mandela was a good man. Not, well, in my opinion, but who's to say? We hold firm convictions. When we're outraged by scandal or injustice, we appeal to a standard we expect others to recognize too, like a chair in a room. Hey, see that chair? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see the chair. That's the common sense of premise 2, right? Objective moral values and duties do exist. We might disagree on some particulars of morality, but almost everyone agrees on at least some core points, right? So, for example, treachery or betrayal is wrong. Gratuitous cruelty is wrong. Love and generosity are good. Justice is a virtue, right? If someone came along saying, actually, I think torturing babies for fun is absolutely morally fine, we wouldn't just say, oh, well, different strokes for different folks. We would say, no, that's terrible. You're wrong. We assume a sane person knows such things are truly wrong. Even those relativists who say there is no absolute morality usually have a line in the sand somewhere. And if you doubt it, try burning a flag or endorsing slavery in front of them. And they'll quickly say, you ought not to do that. In fact, it's hard to consistently live as if no duties or values are objective. We don't live that way. That's reality. If you want to know if they exist, look at reality, how we live. We live as if there are objective moral values and duties. Moral language is all over the place, right? It permeates our lives. Should, the word should, shouldn't, right, wrong, unfair, ought to, right? So premise 2 claims something that is quite intuitive, right? We all know this just naturally, that at least some things are really morally right or wrong, regardless of what anybody thinks. It's not subjective. So we can support premise 2 by pointing out that denying objective morality leads to some disturbing consequences, right? If nothing is objectively wrong, then one cannot truly condemn, say, the Holocaust or the slave trade or serial killers as wrong, or, the whole human trafficking thing. You could really only say, well, like my favorite flavor of ice cream, I just don't like it. Or, our society disapproves. But if you want to do it, who's to say Nazi morality isn't just true for them, right? It would reduce moral discourse to preference, basically. And yet virtually no one anywhere lives that way, thank goodness. We all recognize that a society that, for instance, legalizes rape or genocide is wrong, not just different. Rape isn't wrong because society says so. Society, when it's healthy, says so because it's wrong. There's a big difference. And as Dr. Craig often notes, to deny objective moral values, one has to face that logically rape and cruelty, even murder, wouldn't be really wrong, just not in good taste at the moment for whatever society, right? Just socially disadvantageous or something like that, but it's not wrong or evil. And that's a bullet that very few are willing to bite. Even philosophers who try to be relativist or nihilist in the classroom will act outraged if you steal their laptop or plagiarize their work. So they know. Their moral indignation betrays a belief that some things are truly not okay objectively. So we'll proceed on the very reasonable belief that objective morals exist. We all sense it intuitively and know this. If you're not convinced, I just ask you, do you really think it's only a matter of opinion that, say, abusing a child for sport is wrong? If you find yourself saying no, that's truly wrong always, then you do believe in at least one objective moral truth, and that's all you need for the paradigm to change. So, what about premise one then? If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Why would someone say that? Well, this premise is asserting that God is the foundation or ground of moral objectivity, right? Without a true north or a transcendent anchor, morality would be just a product of natural processes or subjective choices, and thus not truly binding or objective. So think about a world with no God, nothing but matter and energy, right? Plus maybe the laws of physics and so on. And in such a scenario, how would moral values exist in any real objective sense? You could still have preferences or feelings about behaviors ingrained by evolution or society or whatever your chemicals are telling you, but it's hard to see how things would be truly good or evil in any absolute way. As one philosopher put it, if there's no God, we're just highly evolved animals, and animals are not really moral agents. So when a lion kills a zebra, it doesn't commit murder. It just is what it is, right? The circle of life. If a male chimpanzee forces itself on a female, it's not considered morally wrong in the animal kingdom, right? It's just nature. So if we humans are fundamentally no different in kind, because without God, we wouldn't be. We're just all animals, molecules arranged in different random ways. We just happen to be smarter. Why think any of our behavior is infused with moral rightness or wrongness, right? On atheism, many argue our moral intuitions are just a byproduct of sociobiological evolution, right? So over millennia, genes that encouraged cooperation and altruism helped society survive. Behaviors that wrecked social cohesion didn't. So we evolved a sort of moral sense because it was useful. Utilitarian, right? That can explain why we feel some things are wrong, because those feelings had survival value. But if that's all morality is, it's not truly objective. It's just an illusion foisted on us by evolution to make us behave in certain ways, right? Because of how things turned out evolutionary-wise. And renowned biologist E.O. Wilson, an atheist, said as much, right? He said morality is just an illusion fobbed off on our minds by the genes to get us to cooperate. And another scientist, Michael Ruse, says morality is a, quote, biological adaptation, unquote, and any deeper meaning is illusory. When we say, love thy neighbor as thyself, we're doing what our genes want, but there's nothing actually morally true about it in a cosmic sense. Pretty chilling, right? So without God, one could argue anything we call good or evil is ultimately just a matter of how we happen to feel or have been conditioned. Just like you like some movies and you don't. You like some songs and you don't. Some people like to murder kids. It's not my thing, but you do you, right? So he didn't mean people would automatically behave badly, right? In regards to both Wilson and the famous Russian novelist Dostoevsky, he wrote, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. I forgot to give you that quote. And what I was going to say is, he didn't mean people would automatically behave badly. He meant that without a higher law or objective moral values and duties, you don't have a basis to say anything is really forbidden or permitted beyond personal, social preference. So there's no moral law built into the universe, just us doing what we do. Or as Aleister Crowley said, do as thou wilt is the whole of the law. So now some atheists bite the bullet and accept that, right? They become moral relativist or nihilist, saying basically, yep, right and wrong are human inventions. But as we saw, that view is hard to swallow in practice. Who really thinks, again, torturing kids is just a socially discouraged behavior rather than actually evil or wrong? So other atheists will try to find a secular basis for objective morality, right? They might say, for example, well, Objective moral values can exist even without God. They're just brute facts of the universe, or they're grounded in something like human flourishing or well-being. And this view is sometimes called atheistic moral realism, the idea that there are objective moral truths even though there is no God establishing them. So let's examine a couple of these attempts, right? Because I frankly think it makes no sense whatsoever. But let's see. Human flourishing as the ground. Drink. So, some propose that good just means whatever promotes the flourishing or well-being of humans, right? Or sentient creatures. And bad is what detracts from it. So, objective morality could be grounded in the objective facts of what causes humans to thrive, right? So, on this account, you don't need God. You just need an agreement that human flourishing is the standard, right? This is a form of secular humanism. It sounds reasonable at first, right? Of course, we want humans to flourish. But why is human flourishing the ultimate standard, right? If there's no God, humans are just one animal species among others in a vast cosmos, right? Why not the flourishing of some other species? Or of the ecosystem as a whole, right? Vegetation. Preferring our species without a transcendent reason might be called speciesism. Speciesism. Another terrible word to say with your mouth and tongue. And it is an unjustified bias towards our own species. On atheism, to say humans have special moral worth is kind of arbitrary because who says so? We do, right? I mean, that's just self-serving. It's like if cows got together and declared cow flourishing is the ultimate good and went to war with us, right? Meanwhile, wolves might prefer wolf flourishing. So without something above human opinion making humanity the measure of all value is just a choice. Subjective. We could imagine intelligent aliens who think we're wrong, right? In a godless world, it's hard to justify what anyone ought to have value humans highly, right? I mean, look at us. We're not great, right? So why would anybody have decide to value humans highly if say they don't want to, right? We really, without God, I don't see how they could make the case that we're any more important or unimportant than a swarm of gnats that hit your windshield. Who cares? So the other thing is equating moral good with what helps humans flourish has some perplexing implications. For one, if that's all goodness is, then theoretically, if genocide or oppression somehow increased overall human flourishing, right? Say by eliminating undesirables, to make society happier, right? Just saying, a horrific thought experiment, but would that become the good? Most of us would say absolutely not, because certain acts are inherently, objectively wrong no matter what outcome they produce. And that hints that, in fact, my wife and I just watched a movie recently, a series of movies that were new on Netflix, all three of them. The Maze Runner series, right? And the idea was basically the ends justify the means, but they don't. And I would have been fighting on the side of those who didn't approve of killing all these people to come up with a vaccine and submitting them to all sorts of torture and terrible trials. Anyway, all of that hints that human flourishing alone doesn't capture the full moral truth. There's also the issue that naturalism doesn't imbue any particular goal, like flourishing, with moral weight, right? Nature is just red in tooth and claw, right? As Tennyson said, full of creatures flourishing at the expense of other creatures. Survival of the fittest is natural, but not necessarily moral in our usual sense. If we're just products of nature, why not embrace a might makes right ethos, right? Again, we're no important than a swarm of gnats hitting a windshield. The secular humanist is smuggling in a value, right? Compassion, equal worth, that fits better in a theistic worldview where each person is made in God's image, infinitely valuable. But under naturalism, there's no case to be made. Accept your opinion that humans are more worthy of flourishing than other creatures. So then we have moral platonism. Morals are just brute facts, right? Uh, so they suggest that moral values like justice, love, mercy just exist out there as abstract truths, the way mathematical truths exist, right? So, on this view, even without God, justice is a real thing and cruelty is objectively bad, floating somehow in the fabric of reality out there. And this is a strange view. Even Craig says he finds it hard to make sense of it. But let's grant it for just a moment and suppose moral values do exist out there as abstractions, right? They're just out there. We still have the problem of moral obligation. Who or what imposes a duty like justice on me to align with those values, right? So an abstract principle can exist, but it can't command me, right? It has no authority or agency. So if justice just exists on its own, why am I obligated to be just? It's like having a list of moral facts with no enforcer or source. So people could just shrug and say, oh, well, so what if justice exists? I couldn't care less. Right? So without a personal God behind it, morality becomes more like a list of truths, but not commands. So it's got to be objective moral values and duties. There's no one to hold you accountable except other humans whose authority is only whatever we give one another, right? Also, if both good values and evil values just exist, the concept of evil or selfishness would exist as much as goodness, right? So if you got justice existing, you would have unjust, right? So the question arises, why should the good ones triumph? If the universe is indifferent and subjective, maybe cruelty just exists as an abstract value alongside love. And there is no cosmic preference for one another, from one over the other. It's all up to us. And if someone's will is strong enough, they might impose cruelty as their chosen value. In a world without God, right? A tyrant might successfully say, compassion and justice are weak. Strength and cruelty are the real virtues, right? And there'd be no higher court of appeal beyond human power struggles, right? I mean, isn't that? I immediately thought of the Karate Kid, right? You got the one dojo that's like, no mercy, no justice, or finish him, like Mortal Kombat. But when we go to watch the movie Karate Kid, we all know who the right one is. We know that the other guy is a douchebag, right? We know this intuitively. So anyway, you get the point. It makes no sense. And then we have evolutionary ethics, morality as evolved emotion. So as mentioned, evolution can explain feelings of morality, but if that's all there is, it undermines our confidence that those feelings track any truth. If we think morality is objective, we usually think it's something we can discover or be wrong about, right? But if our moral convictions are just installed by evolution to help us survive, not to track moral truth, since under atheism there was no moral truth to track, right? Just survival, then we have reason to doubt the reliability of those convictions. So philosopher Sharon Street has argued that if moral truths existed unrelated to reproductive success, it'd be a huge coincidence for evolution to have wired us with the correct morals. In fact, it likely didn't. It wired us with useful behaviors like protecting kin, reciprocating favors, which we now rationalize as morals. Well, if that's so, why trust your moral sense at all? It's like trusting a compass that wasn't designed to point north, only to get you safely through a forest, or perhaps by consistently pointing some useful direction that isn't true north, right? Depending on the need. So if atheistic evolution is the whole story, then our strong sense that kindness is noble and murder is wrong might just be a pragmatic illusion, right? So many atheists, like biologist Richard Dawkins, indeed says there's ultimately no good, no evil in a universe of blind physical forces, just pitiless indifference, and we dance to our DNA. And that is the bleakness one comes to if one takes God completely out of the picture. Objective morality evaporates, and we're left with, at best, a shared illusion of morality. So we can see why premise one is persuasive, right? It's basically saying God is the best explanation for there being real, objective moral truths that we argued for in premise two. So if there's no God, moral values would either have to be made up by us or just floating inexplicably in the void somewhere, and neither gives a solid foundation. With God, however, it makes sense. Moral values are rooted in God's character, his holy and loving nature, and moral duties are expressed as his commands flowing from that nature. So goodness is not arbitrary, right? God isn't inventing it on a whim. And it's not external to him either, right? They're not platonic. He's not under some higher law. Rather, his very being is the law. He is the logos, mentioned in John 1:1. Goodness is grounded in the ultimate reality, God. Thus, in a theistic view, love is good because God is love. Justice is good because God is just by his very nature. Human life is sacred because humans bear God's image, and so on. And we have moral obligations because we are his creatures accountable to him. And he's written all of that on our hearts, so we know it intuitively. So there is authority behind the moral law. We aren't just interpreting a meaningless universe in moral terms. We are responding to the real moral order God set up and, again, wrote on your heart. And this is why Dr. Craig and many others say that without God, objective morality is at best unlikely or implausible. It's certainly difficult to justify. Whereas with God, objective morality fits like a hand in the glove, right? Of course, there are real right and wrong because there's a real supreme good God who designed us with a moral compass reflecting his character. So if you find premise 2 true, that there are objective moral facts, and premise 1 true, that God is needed for such facts, then the conclusion logically follows, therefore, God exists. In more personal terms, if you believe that love is not just a biochemical illusion, if you believe justice is not just a human construct, if you believe evil is not just, well, whatever society says at the time is bad, but something truly wrong, then to be consistent, you should believe in something beyond nature that grounds those realities. And that something is best described as God, a moral and personal being who is the source of moral truth. So there are objections to this, right? So let's tackle a couple of objections. I think I've got like 4 of them that are the primary ones. And we'll go over them pretty quick here because we're already on an hour. The first objection is the usual one. Evolution explains morality. We don't need God. So we've already touched on this, but let's be clear. Yes, evolution can explain why we might feel certain moral emotions or develop cooperative behavior. But evolution is about survival, not truth. If our moral beliefs are entirely products of evolution, then we have no reason to trust them as true. They were selected to help our ancestors survive, not necessarily to reveal the fabric of morality, if any, under that idea. It could be that in a godless reality, there is no moral reality, just impulses. So if you go that route, you basically concede there's no objective morality, which is bye-bye premise 2. But as we saw, jettisoning objective morality leaves you unable to say, for example, that the Holocaust was wrong or me stealing your wallet is wrong, only that you don't like it, or it didn't help survival in the long run, or for you to pay your bills, which seems woefully inadequate. Moreover, if certain evolved instincts had been different, we'd have different morals, right? For instance, if we were like some insects, right, certain species, we might feel it's good, right? It's a good thing to kill our siblings to climb the hierarchy, right? The fact that we can critique some aspect of our natural impulses by saying, just because evolution gave us an impulse, say tribalism or revenge, doesn't make it right, suggests that we believe in a standard beyond mere evolutionary fitness, right? So evolution in a theistic view could be the tool God uses or used to instill moral understanding in us, but without God guiding it, there's no guarantee it would align with moral truth, because under atheism, it's unguided. It's like trusting a calculator that was put together by random mutations to always give correct answers, Would you rely on that calculator? I wouldn't. So without a designer aiming for truth, you wouldn't. Similarly, our strong conviction that rape or murder are wrong is reliable if a truthful God built that into us. If it's just an ape instinct, maybe it's as arbitrary as our taste for sugary food, which is good for energy, but can lead us astray in modern times, right? So the bottom line here, evolution can describe how we got our moral feelings, but not justify them as true knowledge, right? For justification, we need a grounding, therefore we're right back at God again. And that leads to objection 2. Well, I'm an atheist, but I still believe in objective morality. It's just a brute fact or based on reasoning without human well-being, right? Well, this is essentially the atheistic moral realism we just discussed. Some folks will say, well, look, I don't need God to tell me kindness is good. It's just obviously good. It's an objective fact that suffering is bad and happiness is good, period. So I appreciate the sentiment, acknowledging objective morals, but the question is, on atheism, why? Why are those facts true? If the universe began with a big bang and no purpose, how did moral truths become a part of reality? It's not like quarks and electrons carry moral properties, right? Sam Harris tries to argue that morals are about the well-being of conscious creatures and that science can determine what actions increase well-being. But even if we agree well-being is a goal, that itself is a non-scientific value judgment. Science can tell us how to achieve a goal, but not which goals are ultimate, right? If someone said, I don't value others' well-being, I value power. Well, science can't refute that. It's a philosophical standoff. Harris basically assumes a moral value, well-being is good, and that is very hard to ground without something like, well, because humans are made for a purpose of flourishing, or because love is valued by God. He can't do that. So to say objective morals just exist like Platonic forms also runs into the epistemic question, if they're just floating out there, how do we know them? It's quite a coincidence that blind evolution would just produce minds that correctly perceive, and a coincidence that they're abstract moral truths. As one argument goes, it'd be a happy cosmic accident if the morally right things just so happen to align with what helps a primate species thrive, right? It's far more plausible that our moral beliefs align with moral truths because there was a designer who wanted us to understand and grasp them, even if imperfectly. So without God, expecting evolution plus philosophizing to land on moral truth is like expecting a blindfolded person to solve a Rubik's Cube by chance. Not impossible, but not very likely. We already explained what the most likely thing is. So then there's a third objection. Isn't it possible to have morality without religion? What about cultures without or with different gods or no gods? So individuals and cultures can certainly follow moral codes without believing in God. That is true. The question, again, isn't whether you can behave morally or even believe in morals without professing God. The question is what makes something moral in the first place. For example, an atheist might strongly believe in human rights and live an honorable life championing justice, right? I would applaud them and say they're correctly discerning the moral law. However, I would also gently ask, in your worldview, what makes human rights real and not just a noble fiction? And they might say, it just is wrong to harm others, right? I don't need God for that. And experientially, that's fine. They don't. But I would point out that their conviction fits more naturalistically in a theistic framework where humans have inherent worth from a creator than in a naturalistic one where humans are accidental organisms, right? Like the swarm of gnats we mentioned earlier. So in a sense, I'd say to the atheist, you are borrowing the notion of human dignity and moral truth from a theistic worldview, even if you personally don't believe in God. Your heart knows slavery is wrong because indeed every person bears the image of God. So though you might phrase it differently, like every person has inherent worth, which is a beautiful truth, but one that secular philosophers struggle to justify apart from a transcendent source or God. Again, no God, you're just a swarm of gnats hitting a windshield. You're of no more value than any other species. You're just a random collection of molecules. And many atheists are moral because the moral law is real and written on their hearts, even if they don't attribute it to God. It's still there, even though they won't acknowledge him. So I see that as evidence for God. A law written on hearts suggests a lawgiver who designed us. And then objection 4. What about the Euthyphro dilemma? It is something good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's good, right? And that's a famous challenge from Plato's dialogues, often posed to divine command theory. It sounds like a catch-22, because if you say something is good just because God says so, well, that makes morality seem arbitrary, right? God could command tomorrow that hatred is good. We'd have to accept it, right? Which seems wrong. But if you say God commands it because it's good, then goodness is a standard above or outside God, which undermines God's sovereignty, right? Meaning that God is not the ultimate source of morality, just an enforcer of it. So it's kind of like that winning move at checkers, they think anyway, where no matter where you move, they're going to win. And so the skeptic says, either way, you have a problem. Morality is either arbitrary or God is unnecessary. So how do you deal with that? Well, let me take a drink of water and I'll tell you. So the dilemma is a false one. It misses a third option that Christians and classical theists have affirmed for ages now. Goodness is rooted in God's nature. In other words, God wills something because he is good. God's own holy and loving nature is the standard of goodness. He's not arbitrarily declaring things good, nor is he consulting some external Platonic form like we mentioned earlier. He is the good. God is love. So when God commands, say, do not murder or love your neighbor, he's expressing his own character, right? He is love. God values life. He couldn't just will hatred is good tomorrow any more than the sun could start emitting darkness, right? It's contrary to his nature. That's why it's not really correct to say that all things are possible with God in that sense. All things are logically and morally, possible with God. That's within his nature. So God is by nature kind, just, truthful. And those aren't limits on God. They're the glorious qualities of God. And therefore, God's commands to us are not arbitrary fiats. They are entirely consistent with his character, which is the ultimate good. And that character is not subject to something higher. It simply is what it is, the very definition of goodness. So to reframe Euthyphro, is something good because God commands it? No, it's deeper. God commands it because it's in line with his good nature. And then does God command it because it's good, implying a standard beyond God? No, the standard is God's own being, his very nature. As one summary often used says, God is the paradigm of goodness. His character, perfect holiness, love, justice, etc., is the standard that defines good and evil. So the dilemma is resolved by this third way, right? Morality is neither above God nor arbitrary whim. It's anchored in the unchanging nature of a perfectly good God. And what does that clear up? Well, our moral arguments stand strong here, right? First, we experience a realm of moral values and duties that are objective and real. We live this way. Two, the existence of such a moral realm makes sense if there is a God whose nature is the standard of goodness and who created us to know that standard. And third, without God, that moral realm has no secure foundation or credibility. Therefore, the best explanation is that God exists, specifically a moral, personal God whose character gives rise to moral truth. So now, remember how this ties back to the reality of evil we started with. We said, or I said, The reality of evil actually points to God because it presupposes a real standard of good, right? By the moral argument, the reality of objective good and evil requires God. It's almost poetic. What was once an argument against God, evil, turns into an argument for God, moral law. It doesn't answer all questions about why God allows each instance of evil, but it does show that evil is not a proof of God's absence. And in fact, the opposite, evil as a concept, wouldn't even make sense if there weren't a transcendent good and a God that comes from. So we can only call something evil in a meaningful way that makes sense if an absolute good exists, and that hints at the reality of God. So let's solidify the spiritual significance of this. We're saying that morality, our sense of right and wrong, isn't an accident or illusion. It's a signal of something or someone beyond, right? It's part of the created order. Christianity teaches that in the beginning, God created everything and called it good. There was a moral order, and humans had God's law written on their hearts. So the entrance of sin, rebellion against God, didn't erase the moral law. It corrupted our desires, but we still have conscience as a vestige of God's image, right? So history, from a biblical perspective, is the story of this seed war that we cover here at Pilgrim's Gray Chronicles, and that we talk about here at the Pilgrim's Gray Inn. It's a spiritual conflict between good and evil, God's truth and Satan's lies, right? The seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, going all the way back to Genesis 3:15. This war is often waged on moral grounds. Will we follow the way of love and truth, aligning with God and loving our neighbor, or the way of selfishness and deception, right? Aligning with the adversary. Every moral choice, in a way, is a battle in that cosmic war. And you're pushing your fellow human beings through your example in one direction or the other with everything that you say and do. Here's an illustration, right? A sort of a symbolic image of the cosmic moral struggle. The veneer of the visible world parted like a curtain to reveal a spiritual conflict, right? Heavenly light versus hellish fire behind it. In the Pilgrim's Gray perspective, we often speak of the ancient war behind the veil of reality, right? So this war is not only fought with swords or politics, it's fought in each human heart, right? It's part of the seed war narrative, the long struggle between the offspring of God's promise and the offspring of the evil one, or the adversary. It's essentially a war over truth and morality, over the allegiance of human souls. And every time someone stands up for what is right against pressure to do wrong, that's a victory shining in the seed war. Every time we resist the serpent's whisper, right? Did God really say, anytime we resist any slander against God and instead uphold the good, we are aligning with the seed of the woman, ultimately with Christ, who is the fulfillment of that prophecy and the one who crushes the serpent's head. So when you feel that pang in your conscience or that fire in your spirit at the sight of injustice, you are experiencing the moral law in action written in your heart. A beacon lit by God in you, right? Light the beacons. It's calling you to choose a side in the spiritual conflict. Will you choose love, honesty, courage, selflessness, the side of the moral God, or will you shrug it off and go with your own self-interest, apathy, cruelty, falsehood, your own entertainment, effectively siding with the forces that oppose God? It truly is that stark when you boil it down. And the Apostle Paul wrote that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms in Ephesians 6:12. Those forces of evil often operate through moral deception, twisting good into evil and evil into good, right? But God has given us the moral law, reason, and revelation to see things straight, to not call a crooked what is a straight line, or call evil good. More often, people will take something they know is evil and they want to do it, and then they circle their wagons around it and justify for themselves why it's okay for them to do it, but not for other people. All right, what they're doing is justified. So again, we began with logic, the ontological argument. We moved to love, the moral argument grounded in God's loving nature. And then we saw how evil, far from disproving God, can actually point us to the reality of God's goodness. And we answered some tough questions and found that the moral argument, when reinforced on all sides, is a logically airtight case for God's existence if you accept its common sense premises. But beyond logic, I want to emphasize the love. We're not just talking about a cold moral principle out there. We're pointing to the moral God, the God who is not only perfectly just, but also rich in love and mercy, right? These things shouldn't just be things that we know about in our heads because, our adversary knows that God exists and knows what he thinks and is aware of these truths and doesn't care, right? He's still the adversary. So before we close, let's circle back to where we started from logic to love. We used logic to arrive at God, but ultimately the goal is not just to acknowledge an unmoved mover or a cosmic lawgiver, but to enter into a relationship of love with a God who is the very source of love. The existence of a moral God is not just a theory to prove, right? It's an invitation to trust that our longing for justice and goodness will be fulfilled, that evil will not have the last word, that our moral struggles mean something in the grand scheme of things. It's why we like movies with happy endings. Every time you choose good over evil, you echo God's character and contribute a verse to the story of the seed war, right? Pushing back against the adversary darkness with your light. And when you fail, as we all do, the moral argument also points you to your need for grace, because if that moral standard is real and we fall short, then we need forgiveness. Now, in the Christian narrative, which is what I am, that's exactly what God offers through Jesus: forgiveness and the power to grow in virtue. The reality of evil points to the moral God, and the moral God points us to the remedy for evil, his own sacrificial love. So, fellow pilgrims, I encourage you to reflect on the clues of morality in your own life. Have you sensed that a tug of war between good and evil is in your heart? Or do you feel that hunger for justice in the world, you want to do something? You shouldn't dismiss those as merely evolutionary quirks. Consider that they might be whispers of a moral lawgiver calling you. And when you feel outraged by evil, let it drive you not to despair, but to the straight line, right? To God's standard of goodness, and ultimately to God himself, who alone can empower us to overcome evil with good, right? Plus, he helps you see the line is straight. And so as we end the show tonight, let's remember evil is real, but it's parasitic on the good, right? It doesn't have independent existence, like C.S. Lewis said. Good can exist without evil. Evil can't exist without good. It's a perversion of the good, and good is ultimately grounded in God, who will win in the end, right? And we've been told and promised that the things that we suffer here and see others suffering won't be able to be compared to what awaits us, the good that it produces. So the long war between good and evil will conclude with good triumphant, justice vindicated, and every tear wiped away. And our role now is to choose the good, to join the winning side, right? Not by might, but by aligning with the moral truth God has given us and by receiving his love. But that is now. You don't get to join sides after the war is over and say, oh, well, I was on this side over here, the right side. It's too late then. You chose your side, right? You were treasonous and a traitor all the way to the end. And in my opinion, you're probably not going to be happy in God's presence anyway, because in order for you to have done that, that would mean that you don't like any of those qualities anyway, really. You just don't. You prefer to determine for yourself, apart from God, what's going to be right for you. And you don't really care about what he has to say or think. So, anyway, I thank you for walking the road with me to the end tonight. From the heights of abstract logic to the very human struggle with evil, and onward to the discovery of a transcendent moral love at the heart of reality. So if you found your mind stimulated or your heart stirred, I encourage you to not let the discussion end here. think on it. If God is the source of morality, that has implications for every aspect of life, how we treat others, what we live for, and how we handle our own failures, and forgiving ourselves and others. And I'd like to leave you with a call to reflection. This week, notice the moral dimensions of your experiences. Pay attention to your conscience. When you encounter a moral choice, however small it is, see it in the light of this cosmic seed war backdrop, a skirmish in the great seed war, right? Ask yourself, what would align with the good, with God's character in this situation? And then dare to do it, right? And also reflect on the converse, the times you see or are tempted by something wrong. Instead of just feeling guilty or angry, let it remind you, oh, this is why I know there's a God, because I know this ought not to be, right? Whether it's something you did or you saw somebody else do, and let that thought recenter you on God's reality and presence. And finally, I invite you to join us next time, where we'll likely dive into another facet of our faith. Next week, I have plans to explore some divine attributes, like God's omniscience, his all-knowing nature, and something some of you might be familiar with called God's middle knowledge, or Molinism. If you haven't heard of middle knowledge, it's a concept about God's knowledge of all hypothetical scenarios, like what would happen if, and it ties into human free will and God's providence, right? And we'll see how God's omniscience, including knowing all possible worlds, doesn't make us robots, but actually assures us of his perfect plan. And it's a topic that I hope will stretch your mind and to deepen your appreciation for God's wisdom. I know it did for me. Until then, remember that the moral law points to a moral lawgiver, and that lawgiver is not a cold tyrant, but a loving God who wants you to join him in the triumph of what is good. In our journey from logic to love, we find that the ultimate logic is love. For God is love, right? And in him, all the lines run straight, and all the shadows are light, because in him, he is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Anyway, I thank you for listening to Pilgrim's Great Chronicles. Again, Robert Clark, your host. Please like, share, and subscribe so that you don't ever miss a show. We do 3 a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I try to have them released at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. I don't always hit the mark, but I try. And on Monday nights, we do these long-form shows. Wednesday is also popular, where we go over your emails. It's my way of saying thank you for listening and for supporting and subscribing and keeping up with the show. So believe me when I tell you, I do everything I can to try to read everything we get. As we get more followers, I'll probably be doing that less and less, because I can't keep, even right now with this, we haven't even been a podcast for a year, and I'm having difficulty keeping up with all of it. Sometimes I'm only able to hit a like, and sometimes I miss your comments because I don't see them. I'm not notified of them, but I try to dig in. I try to spend at least one day where I just go over all of that while I'm drinking my morning coffee, or, my wife is running an errand. I go over all your emails. Anyway, in the meantime, stay vigilant, stay hopeful, and keep that lantern of truth burning bright. And God bless you guys, and have a good night, and Godspeed to you as you live out this work week, which I got to return to work Wednesday this week, so I have an extra day off. It'll be awesome. Anyway, later, folks. Love y'all.
Gather round, ye travelers, lend me your ear. A tale of heroes who knew no fear. Through shadowed woods and mountains steep, their legacy lives where the wild winds sweep. Raise your tankards high and sing for the great pilgrims and what they bring. To every corner their stories stay. Hail the chronicles of Pilgrim's Grave. Through cursed lands where few would tread, the brave walk forth where Raise your 10 cards high and sing for the great pilgrims and what they bring to every corner. Their stories stay. Hail the chronicles of Pilgrim's Grave. Strong in every heart, their timeless song murs carried on the ale-soaked breeze, songs as endless as the trees. Raise your 10 cups.